As I said during the meditation, I'm going to be talking about one of the chapters in the book, Here All Along by Sarah Hurwitz, who we've been reading together as a community. We've been doing this now 6 months because we're on chapter 6 this evening. Prayer and More, Finding the Primal in Jewish Spiritual Practice. One of my favorite topics. I could talk about it all day, but I promise I won't. In New York City, on the Lower East Side, there's the Eldridge Street Synagogue. It was built in 1887 during a period of mass immigration to the United States. Between 1880 and 1924, more than 2.5 million Jews came to the U.S., 85% from Eastern Europe, where many of our families came from. 75% of those settled on the Lower East Side. This synagogue was grand for its day. Previous synagogues, immigrants into this country had adapted from other structures, event halls, small storefronts, or even old churches. But now, to show that American Jews in some ways had made it, they built this grand synagogue, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which if you go there now is in the middle of Chinatown. It's in the middle of a whole Chinese neighborhood there because we know that the Lower East Side is a place that new immigrants from all different walks of life, from all parts of the world, came, settled, and then moved on. And the same thing happened with the Eldridge Street Synagogue. It was grand for its day, and then the Jewish community moved on and fell into disrepair. Beginning in the 1980s, people wanted to see it refurbished and was finally finished in 2007. But if you go into the Eldridge Street Synagogue and you stand in the places where people prayed, you will notice that there are grooves in the floor. They didn't refurbish it so much to take out all of the human beings who had been in that space and praying in that space. And as the guides like to talk about, why were the floor grooves in places where people were standing? Because this is what they were doing. And making that groove in the floor, shuckling back and forth, back and forth. If you ask Orthodox Jews, why do people shuckle when they pray? Why do they do that movement of moving back and forth? And I'm sure many of you have seen that in more traditional synagogues. One explanation that's been given to me is that people are like a candle flickering the spirit to God, and that's why they're moving like this, like a flickering candle. I actually thought it was probably a more practical thing, that in Eastern Europe and many of the countries that we came from, it was cold, even inside, and that they had to shuckle back and forth in order to keep warm. So what is it about prayer? Do we shuckle back and forth because of religious fervor? Because it's cold and we have an obligation and we need to be there? We want to be together with community? In Jewish tradition, we are required to pray 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And these 3 times were related to the times that sacrifices were offered in the temple, once in the morning and then in the afternoon. And then there was a sacrifice that burnt all night, and so that was the evening sacrifice and became the evening prayer. The word for sacrifice in Hebrew is korban, from the word karov, to become close. That we sacrificed animals to God in order to get close to God as people understood God in the ancient world. They thought they needed to feed God in some way. And so they brought animals and they sacrificed them. And can you imagine what that must have been like? The sights, the sounds, the smells. They used to have incense, which if you go to some churches, they still have incense. And the reason they have the incense is because some of the smells were not as pleasant as others. But can you imagine how all of your senses would have been ignited during that prayer experience? And yet after the Second Temple was destroyed, the rabbis decided we can no longer sacrifice without having our holy temple in Jerusalem. The sacrifice will be something that we'll do way off in the future when the third temple is built, but in the meantime, we have to find a different way of approaching God. They said instead of doing the avodah that was done in the temple, the worship of animal sacrifice that was done in the temple, we're now going to do avodah shebelev, the worship, the sacrifice of the heart. And so we're not going to have all of that sensory experience. We're going to have words, perhaps melodies. And for many of us, we struggle with feeling that prayer. Some people come because it's an obligation. Other people come because they want the community. And either way, we know that the minyan, the idea of having 10 people available for prayer and being together, is important in Judaism. But how do we get that third element to capture some sense of religious fervor? Sarah Hurwitz gives these 4 pieces of advice about what she learned from her own struggle with prayer and her own desire to understand how can we make these ancient words of the prayer book come off the page and come into our hearts and move us. The first thing she says is, don't look at the siddur, don't look at the prayer book like it's a textbook, like you're trying to study for an exam, like you're trying to learn some information. And then she says, don't get hung up on God language. Just try to experience God. Don't try to intellectualize God so much. We're so good at trying to figure out, do I believe in God? Do I not believe in God? What do I think that God is? She says, just try to experience God. It reminds me of a story that my teacher, Rabbi Larry Kushner, told us about when he was teaching some students of his about God, and he asked them if they believed in God, and each and every one of them said, no, of course not. We believe in science, we're rational beings. And then he changed the question, and he said, tell me of an experience you've had with God. And everybody had a story. He said, when we shifted it from the intellect, from thinking about what could God be in the world, to our own experiences of holiness, of divinity, they all had a story. I do an exercise with my 12th graders with my Kabbalat Torah class that's very similar, and I say to them, I want you to fill out the end of this sentence. A time I felt spiritual. And then I say, in synagogue, in nature, and I give a lot of different examples, and I said, you define spiritual. And everybody takes out their notebook. I say, a time I felt spiritual, and everybody's jotting something down. Nobody seems to have an issue when you ask it like that. Everybody knows what you're talking about and has had that experience. So try not to intellectualize God, but to feel, to put our heart forward. The third piece of advice she gives us is to stay with a word or phrase if it catches you. Perhaps you're in the siddur and all of a sudden a word comes off and you just want to sit on the word shalom, or ma'ariv aravim, God who brings on the evening. What does it mean to feel the darkness coming or the light in the morning? What are words we could just savor for a moment and just repeat those over and over? And fourth, and this is perhaps the hardest thing for us as modern people, allow yourself to be vulnerable. Allow yourself to just be present in the moment and to be wherever you are, to sing loudly even if your voice isn't great, to move even if you feel like others are looking at you. You know, one of the things that I think is amazing, and I think other people have had this experience, when you go into a Baptist church, everybody's just standing and moving and clapping any way that they want to because as the Spirit is moving them. And everybody will say, Rabbi, that's such an amazing experience. Why can't we do it here? And I say, do it here. Do it here. Bring that feeling. Don't be so inhibited. Reb Zalman, who she quotes at the beginning of the book, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was a rabbi who just died a few years ago, who had a Lubavitch education when he was younger in Europe, and he came to the United States, and he saw the modern world, and he wanted to bring the fervor of Lubavitch Judaism to what we do, but he wanted it not to have all of the accretions of the sexism and the bigotry that is often part of traditional Judaism. He said, no, we want to take the spirit and we want to strip it of all of the other stuff that isn't as good. We want to bring it into the modern world. And he said, how do we do that? He said, we talk too much and we feel too little. And I know as Jews that's hard for us. Talking we're comfortable with. Feeling, not so much sometimes. The rabbis of old used to have this advice about how we should pray and to open our hearts. They said that we should pray 1 hour before we pray. For a whole hour, come and pray, and then you'll be ready to pray. Another thing that they did is that they used to add contemporary prayers that speak to a current generation. We see our prayer book here, which has now been brought down to a little more concise size. But if you look at an old prayer book, what happens is you had the original prayers, and then people got tired of the original prayers. And so the rabbi said, well, we need something to get people's heart going. And so they added more prayers. And then the next generation says, well, now we have those prayers. So they added more prayers. And they added more prayers. And they added more prayers and more prayers. And what happened by the mid-19th century when the Reform movement came along is that the prayer book was pretty unwieldy. How many people have been to a 3 or 4 hour Shabbat service before? Because we kept adding and adding and adding prayers. And so the Reform movement said, you know what, we can't just add, we also have to subtract a little bit, have to take things away. But the additions were the rabbi's way of saying we need to find something that speaks to our contemporary age, that says to us not just what our ancestors did, not the connection with the past is not important, it is. It's a big piece of what we do, and part of the power of the words that we say over and over and over again is that we know them. Jews around the world say them, and Jews have been saying them for centuries. Sometimes when it's hard to find the right words in prayer, to have somebody say, this is the words to prayer. But we can't just get stuck on the page. How do we take the page and make it soar? Hurwitz says, you can't delegate prayer to someone else. She said some people, they go to synagogue and what happens? They sit there in the pews, they sit there in their chairs, and they don't participate at all. She said, you know what that's like? It's like going to spin class, checking your phone, and chatting with your neighbor, and then expecting somehow you're going to get in shape. The same thing is true with prayer, that if you come into the synagogue and you don't put yourself into it all, you can't expect to get the results. Another metaphor that I like, and I think it's particularly appropriate tonight, and thank you, Diane, for the beautiful music that you've brought, because I think they're bringing new music and bringing new ways of looking at the service, and that really does uplift us, is to think of the rabbi and the cantor and those who are leading prayers not as the actors and singers in the play, but as the directors. You're the actors. That's the secret here. Is that if we're up here directing and no one is out there acting, it's not going to be a very good performance. That this is a drama that takes all of us together. But prayer for some feels just like that, performative and not real. How can we make prayer real? How can we help you do a compelling acting job? To move the prayer from our head to our heart and soul. Well, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, a Hasidic rabbi, he teaches this: fake it until you make it. All right, he doesn't quite say it like that, but that's the gist of what he's trying to say. He says, why does it say in Ve'ahavta that prayer should be on our hearts instead of in our hearts? Right, that we're going to teach them to our children, and the prayer will be on our hearts, right? But sometimes our hearts aren't open, right? We know those words well, but sometimes our hearts aren't open. But if he said, if we say those words and we just place them on our hearts, then the moment our hearts do open, the words will fall in. That the moment our hearts open, the words fall in. Prayer is a discipline, just like exercise, just like anything else. We might not feel great, and yet sometimes we go to our workout anyway. We might not be in the mood, but in the end, if we go to our workout, we know that we get ourselves into physical shape, and we know that we feel better about it, and prayer is the same way. It's a discipline. That the more we do it, the more the word is on our hearts, the more opportunity, the more chance that our heart will open and those prayers will go in. Sometimes people ask me the question, Rabbi, what's the best prayer experience you've ever had? What's the secret sauce to having a great prayer experience? People used to ask me this question all the time when I'd come back from my time at Usru. We heard that camp prayer is just the best. What makes camp prayer so great? And you know what I found after all my years at camp? Is that there was nothing about the music that was so great. There was nothing about what the kids said when they got up in front of people that was so great and interesting. Sometimes it was, and sometimes the music was nice. But sometimes it wasn't. And sometimes the kids would lead the prayers in a way that was a little bit ham-handed. Sometimes they couldn't lead the prayer very well at all. What was it about that experience that was so wonderful? Because people would want to transfer. If we just transfer the music from camp to the synagogue, it's all going to change. It's going to be like camp. And I said, no. You can't transfer one setting to another. What's it about camp? All those people that are sitting together at the Beit Tfilah in the sanctuary with you, they're the same people you were swimming with this afternoon, and the same people you ate with earlier today. That the sense of community, the sense of belonging, the sense of connectedness, that is the secret sauce of what happens in prayer at camp. And they're having all of those experiences together. And so I think that what makes prayer really good is when you feel that sense of connectivity. And it can happen outside of camp. But it's not necessarily about transferring what's done there. It has to be authentic to the space in which you are in. And the best prayer experiences I've had is when everybody came into the space and said, I'm here, I'm really here. I'm not halfway somewhere else, my head's not somewhere else, I'm not checking my phone, I'm here with you. I'm participating, not just with my head, but I'm committed to bringing my heart and my soul. Those are the moments in which the prayer has been the best. Maybe we don't come because we're in the mood, but we come for the community, and that's okay too. There's an old joke about an atheist who goes to shul every Shabbos and sits next to his friend Ginsburg. One day, someone asked the atheist why he keeps coming to services if he doesn't believe in God. And he replies, Ginsburg goes to shul to talk to God. I go to shul to talk to Ginsburg. That we might have different motivations for coming. We might have different motivations even for praying. Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw teaches that. He says, prayer is about reaching. It's about reaching into ourselves, it's about reaching up to God, and it's about reaching out to others. And each of us might come for a different desire, a different need, a different way of approaching our prayer. But then Rabbi Nachman turns it on its head and he said, but all those reachings are one and the same. That if we come for community, we sometimes find ourselves in God. That if we come for God, we sometimes can look deep in our souls and make a new friend. That all those reachings are one. This particular teaching about prayer is on our Beth Emet website, and I'm going to conclude with what else I wrote about what we're trying to do in prayer at Beth Emet and in prayer in general. At Beth Emet, we show reverence for traditional Jewish prayer forms while experimenting and innovating, interpreting Torah, and taking time for silence and personal prayer. We believe that the strength and depth of communal worship come from creating a structure that brings us together as a community while leaving enough room for personal prayer and introspection. We invite you to join us on our communal prayer journey and to carve out your own path as well. And that's what I invite us to do today, next week, and whenever we come for prayer. To come for community, to come for ourselves, to come for God, to come as we are, but to try to come in a way that brings our heart and our soul. And may we find elevation, may we find depth, and may we rise from our prayer better persons. Amen.